My name is Violet, and the day my marriage truly ended began with a text message that arrived just after breakfast on a grey Tuesday morning, the kind of dreary October day that settles over London like a damp blanket, making everything feel heavy and inevitable. I was in our Kensington flat, standing at the ironing board in what James called his dressing room, pressing the creases from one of his bespoke shirts, when my phone buzzed on the windowsill with a sound that would, looking back, change absolutely everything. The message was brief, almost surgical in its coldness. Won't be able to take you to Rebecca's wedding this weekend. Issues with the guest list, last-minute changes. Will explain later. I stopped mid-iron, the steam hissing softly as I read the words again, then once more, trying to make them mean something different from what they so clearly said. His sister's wedding, the event we'd had circled in our calendar for 6 months, the one I'd bought a new dress for, emerald silk that had cost more than I'd normally spend, still hanging in our wardrobe with the tags attached. I set down the iron carefully, unplugged it with hands that had started to shake just slightly, and rang him immediately, watching the screen as it connected, then listening to it ring once, twice, 3 times before his voicemail kicked in with that smooth, professional recording. I tried again, and this time it went straight to voicemail, which meant he'd declined the call, had seen my name on his screen and deliberately sent me through. By the 3rd attempt, something cold and sharp was forming in my chest, replacing the confusion with something far more dangerous, something that felt oddly like clarity. The rest of the morning crawled by in a peculiar fog where I seemed to be watching myself from a distance, loading the dishwasher, wiping down the marble countertops that James insisted must never have watermarks, checking my work emails, all whilst my mind spun in increasingly dark circles beneath the surface of these ordinary tasks. It wasn't until I was putting away the laundry that afternoon that I found the receipt, tucked deep in the inside pocket of James's charcoal cashmere coat, folded small as though he'd meant to hide it but had forgotten. Arspray, the jeweler on Bond Street. Purchase date, 3 days ago. Item, platinum necklace, sapphire pendant. Total, £3,400. I sat on the edge of our bed, staring at those numbers, and felt something inside me finally, irrevocably break, because I hadn't received a necklace. Our 3rd wedding anniversary had passed 2 months ago without acknowledgement, my birthday 3 weeks before that had merited only a petrol station card, but someone, somewhere, was wearing a sapphire necklace that cost more than most people earned in a month. The late nights at the office, the way he flinched when I touched him, the phone calls he took in other rooms, the new cologne, all of it suddenly made perfect, horrible sense, clicking into place like pieces of a puzzle I'd been refusing to see. I should have cried, I suppose, that's what happens in films, but instead I felt a strange cold clarity settling over me, sharp and bright and surprisingly energizing, and I stood up, walked to my handbag, and rang Sophie. I need you to pull up all the details for the Hampton House event this weekend, I said, my voice steady. Check the guest list for James Morrison, +1. Her keyboard clicked rapidly. Yes, his listed. Room booked Friday and Saturday, junior suite. Perfect. I'll be there Friday morning to oversee preparations personally. And Sophie? Not a word about this conversation. After I hung up, I sat in the silence of our bedroom and allowed myself a small, cold smile, because James didn't know, couldn't possibly imagine, what he just walked into by cancelling my invitation to his sister's wedding. The Hampton House, that beautiful boutique hotel where Rebecca was getting married, where my husband had booked a room for himself and his mistress, wasn't just any hotel. It was mine. I owned it. I didn't sleep that night. I lay beside James in the darkness, listening to him breathe with that slight whistle he'd always had, watching shadows from passing cars sweep across our bedroom ceiling, and I thought about how we'd arrived at this particular moment, this specific betrayal. 5 years ago I was assistant manager at a struggling boutique hotel in Mayfair called the Sterling, a beautiful old building with good bones but terrible management, bleeding money every quarter whilst the owners argued about what to do with it. They were preparing to sell, probably to developers who'd gut the place and turn it into luxury flats, erasing 100 years of history for profit margins and penthouses. But I saw something else entirely when I walked through those corridors, something the owners had stopped seeing years ago. I saw what it could be, what it deserved to be, and I spent 3 months putting together a proposal that consumed every evening after my shifts ended, running numbers until my eyes burned, creating projections and strategies and plans. I scraped together every penny I'd saved since I was 16, took out a loan that terrified me when I signed the papers, and made an offer the owners accepted because frankly no one else wanted the headache. James, my boyfriend at the time, thought I'd completely lost my mind. A hotel, he'd said, laughing in that particular way he had that made you feel small and foolish. Violet, you're 28 years old, you're going to bankrupt yourself playing hotel proprietor. It's a childish dream, financial suicide really. I bought it anyway, and for the next 2 years I worked 16-hour days, 7 days a week, learning plumbing when pipes burst at 3 in the morning, negotiating with suppliers, charming food critics, personally training every member of staff until they understood exactly what I expected. I chose every paint color, every piece of furniture, every flower arrangement, refusing to delegate the details that would make or break the guest experience. I renamed it the Hampton House after the street where I grew up in Bristol, the only bit of sentimentality I allowed myself, and slowly, carefully, it became not just profitable but genuinely successful, the kind of place couples chose specifically for their weddings, where corporate clients booked suites for important visitors, where food bloggers praised our restaurant in glowing terms. And through it all, James belittled it at every opportunity. Still playing hotels, darling, he'd say at dinner parties, usually after his third gin and tonic, his voice carrying that edge of amused condescension. Violet runs a little boutique place, sweet really, keeps her occupied. I never corrected him, never mentioned that I owned it outright, and his family naturally assumed I was just a manager, some sort of glorified receptionist, certainly nothing particularly impressive. His mother Patricia made it abundantly clear I wasn't quite good enough for her son, the brilliant financial analyst with his promising career and his proper family connections. I let them think it, let them underestimate me, because there's something useful about being invisible, about people not quite seeing what you're capable of until it's far too late for them to do anything about it. Now, lying in the darkness beside my unfaithful husband, I slipped quietly out of bed and padded to my office, opening my laptop to pull up the Hampton House management system with its familiar interface glowing softly in the dark room. The Morrison wedding file contained every detail: 87 guests, garden ceremony, reception in the ballroom, vintage champagne, orchid centerpieces, string quartet. And there, exactly as Sophie had confirmed, James Morrison, +1, junior suite, garden view, checking in Friday afternoon. I sat back and began to plan, because this weekend was going to be very interesting indeed. Friday morning arrived with unexpected sunshine, the kind of crisp autumn day that makes London look like it's trying to apologize for all the grey that came before, and I stood in the foyer of Hampton House watching my staff perform their final checks with the practiced efficiency I'd spent years cultivating. The hotel looked absolutely perfect, exactly as I'd intended when I'd overseen every detail of this week's preparations. White roses cascaded down the main staircase in carefully arranged profusion, soft lighting created pools of warmth throughout the reception area, and every surface gleamed with the kind of understated elegance that whispered money rather than shouting it. Sophie appeared at my elbow with her tablet, running through the final checklist with the calm competence that made her invaluable. Caterers confirmed for 2 o'clock, florist is finishing the ceremony arch now, string quartet arrives at 3 for sound check, and the bride's getting ready in the honeymoon suite as requested. Excellent, I said, smoothing down my dress, a simple navy shift that looked professional without being severe, the kind of thing that allowed me to blend into the background whilst maintaining absolute authority. Guest arrivals? Starting any minute now. Most of the wedding party stayed elsewhere last night, but we've got about 30 rooms booked for tonight. Including one junior suite with a garden view, I thought, feeling that cold clarity settle over me again like armor. The first guests began trickling in around 11, well-dressed people with that particular confidence that comes from inherited money and private educations, the kind of crowd James's family moved in effortlessly whilst I'd always felt like an outsider performing a role I'd never quite mastered. I positioned myself near the reception desk, close enough to observe but far enough to appear uninvolved, just another member of staff ensuring everything ran smoothly, and I waited with the patience I'd learned from years of dealing with difficult clients and impossible demands. Then, just after noon, I saw him through the glass doors. James stepped out of a sleek black car, looking confident and relaxed in expensive casual clothes, the kind of studied carelessness that probably took him an hour to achieve, and beside him emerged a young woman who made my breath catch for just a moment. She was probably 25, blonde hair falling in those effortless waves that actually require considerable effort, wearing a red dress that was simultaneously too tight, too short, and too low-cut for a wedding, the kind of outfit that screamed desperation to be noticed whilst pretending not to care. She laughed at something James said, touching his arm with casual ownership, marking territory in the way women do when they want everyone to know exactly what's theirs, and I watched my husband smile at her with an expression I hadn't seen directed at me in years, possibly ever. They walked toward the entrance together, James's hand resting possessively on the small of her back, both of them radiating that particular smugness of people who think they're getting away with something. The automatic doors slid open with their quiet whisper, and they stepped into my foyer, into my hotel, onto my territory. James approached the reception desk where Michael, my head receptionist, stood with his professional smile firmly in place. "Good afternoon, welcome to the Hampton House. May I have your name please?" "James Morrison," my husband said with casual arrogance, the tone of someone accustomed to being important. "I'm the bride's brother." I stepped forward then, my heels clicking softly on the marble floor, and watched his face as he turned toward the sound and saw me standing there. The blood drained from his features so quickly I thought he might actually faint, his mouth opening and closing without producing any sound whilst the woman beside him looked between us with dawning confusion. "Good afternoon, James," I said, keeping my voice perfectly pleasant, professionally warm. "Welcome to my hotel." The silence stretched between us like something physical, heavy, and suffocating, whilst James stood there looking as though I'd just materialized out of thin air like some kind of avenging ghost he'd never expected to encounter. His mouth worked soundlessly for several long seconds before he finally managed to produce words, though they came out strangled and barely coherent. "Violet, what are you, this is your..." "Yes, James," I said, keeping my voice calm and professional despite the rage simmering beneath my carefully maintained surface. "My hotel. The childish dream you mocked, the financial suicide you predicted, remember? I acquired the sterling 3 years ago, renovated it, built its reputation from absolutely nothing, and your sister chose it for her wedding because of that reputation, the one I created." The blonde woman, who I assumed must be the owner of the sapphire necklace, clutched at James's arm with dawning horror as she finally began to grasp the situation she'd walked into, her perfectly made-up face shifting through expressions of confusion, embarrassment, and something that looked almost like fear. Other guests in the foyer had started to notice the tension radiating from our little tableau, conversations dying away as people turned to watch with that barely concealed interest that society types have for potential scandal unfolding in real time. Sophie materialized at my shoulder, silent and efficient, ready to intervene if I gave her the signal, her presence a reminder that I wasn't alone here, that this was my territory and I had people loyal to me. James tried desperately to regain some control over the situation, rapidly spiraling away from him. "Violet, this isn't, we should talk privately, not here, surely we can." But before he could finish that thought, before he could attempt whatever explanation or justification he'd concocted, Rebecca appeared at the top of the grand staircase in her dressing gown, having clearly heard the commotion from her suite. "James," she called down, her face lighting up with genuine pleasure at seeing her brother. "You're here. I was worried you'd be late, and this must be..." She trailed off as she descended the stairs, her smile faltering as she took in the scene properly, looking from James to the woman in the inappropriate red dress to me standing there in my professional navy shift. "Where's Violet?" Rebecca asked, confusion creeping into her voice. "James, I thought you were bringing Violet as your plus one?" The silence that followed felt absolutely deafening, filling the entire foyer with the weight of James's betrayal made suddenly, irrevocably public to his own family. I spoke before James could attempt another lie, keeping my voice gentle because Rebecca genuinely didn't deserve to have her wedding day poisoned by her brother's choices. "I'm here, Rebecca. Congratulations on your wedding, everything is prepared exactly as you requested, down to the last detail." Rebecca's eyes widened as she looked between her brother, me, and the blonde woman whose hand had now slipped from James's arm as though she'd been burned. "James," Rebecca said slowly, her voice dropping to something cold and dangerous. "What exactly have you done?" James opened his mouth, closed it again, looking for all the world like a fish gasping on a dock, unable to form any response that wouldn't condemn him further. I didn't wait for whatever pathetic excuse he might eventually manufacture. If you'll excuse me, I said, directing my words to Rebecca whilst completely ignoring James and his mistress, I have a wedding to coordinate and ensure runs perfectly. Sophie will show Mr. Morrison and his guest to their room. Rebecca, I'll send champagne up to your suite. You should be relaxing before your ceremony, not dealing with family drama. I turned on my heel and walked away with my head high, my spine straight, every inch the professional hotel proprietor, and only when I turned the corner into the private corridor leading to my office did I allow my hands to shake, just for a moment, before I steadied myself again. Behind me I could hear Rebecca's voice rising in fury, could hear James's pathetic attempts at explanation, could hear the whispers of the other guests as the gossip began to spread. Good, I thought. Let them all know. Let his entire family see exactly what kind of man he really is. In my office I finally allowed myself to collapse into my chair, the professional mask slipping away for just a moment as the reality of what had just happened crashed over me like a wave I'd been holding back through sheer force of will. Sophie entered quietly, closing the door behind her with a soft click that somehow felt protective, and set a cup of tea on my desk without a word, the Earl Grey I always drank when I was stressed, perfectly made with just a splash of milk. You were magnificent out there, she said, settling into the chair across from my desk. But I didn't feel magnificent, I felt raw and exposed and furious, all the emotions I'd been suppressing whilst standing in that foyer now surging up with a vengeance that made my hands tremble as I lifted the teacup. The tears came then, finally, not the gentle crying of sadness but the hot angry tears of someone who's been betrayed and diminished and lied to for far too long, and Sophie simply sat there whilst I wept, not offering platitudes or false comfort, just being present. When the storm passed I felt oddly lighter, as though crying had released some pressure valve I didn't know I'd been holding closed, and I wiped my eyes with the tissue Sophie wordlessly provided, took a long breath, and straightened my spine. A memory surfaced unbidden, sharp and painful in its clarity. Our wedding 3 years ago, the rushed registry office ceremony that James had insisted upon, claiming that big weddings were a waste of money and we should be practical, sensible, adult about such things. I'd wanted something more, had dreamed of a proper celebration with flowers and music and people we loved, but James had been so persuasive, so logical, talking about deposits on flats and saving for our future, making me feel childish for wanting what he dismissed as frivolous pageantry. Now, helping coordinate his sister's elaborate wedding at my own hotel, I finally understood the truth I'd been too naive or too hopeful to see back then. James hadn't wanted to celebrate me, hadn't valued me enough to make our union into something worth commemorating, had seen marrying me as a box to tick rather than a joy to share. He'd never loved me the way I desperately wanted to believe he did. My phone buzzed with a text from Michael at reception. Situation developing in room 412. Morrison and guest having loud argument. Other guests complaining about noise. I almost smiled at that, imagining James's carefully constructed lies unraveling under the weight of reality, his mistress finally grasping that she'd been brought to a family wedding as his wife's replacement, the humiliation of it all crashing down. Another text arrived, this one from an unknown number that turned out to be Rebecca. Violet, I'm so sorry. I had no idea James was doing this to you. He's despicable. Please know that I want you at my wedding, you've done so much to make this day perfect, and you deserve to be celebrated not humiliated. That kindness, unexpected and genuine, nearly undid me all over again, but I pulled myself together and responded with professional warmth whilst avoiding the deeper emotional implications. Sophie spoke quietly from her chair. The Ashford Grand rang whilst you were in the foyer. 3rd time this month. They want to poach you again, offered an obscene salary and full creative control. I looked at her, at this woman who'd been loyal through everything, who'd helped me build Hampton House into what it was, and felt something shift inside me, some fundamental understanding clicking into place. Tell them no, I said firmly. Tell them I'm not for sale, that this place is mine and I built it and nothing they offer could make me leave it. Sophie smiled, the kind of smile that said she'd expected exactly that answer. Already did. Just wanted to remind you that other people see your worth, even when the people closest to you are too blind or too threatened to acknowledge it. I stood, smoothed down my dress, checked my reflection in the small mirror behind my door. Professional, composed, in control. I had a wedding to run, and I was going to make it absolutely perfect, because that's what I did. Patricia Morrison arrived at 2:30 in a chauffeured Mercedes, stepping out onto the forecourt with the kind of effortless elegance that comes from generations of inherited wealth and absolute certainty in one's place in the world. I watched from the window of my office as she paused to take in the facade of Hampton House, her expression shifting from polite interest to something approaching genuine appreciation as she studied the restored Victorian architecture, the carefully maintained gardens, the discreet signage that whispered quality rather than shouting it. She'd always treated me with barely concealed disdain during the 3 years I'd been married to her son, making it abundantly clear through 1,000 small cuts that I wasn't quite good enough for the Morrison family, that my background was too ordinary, my education too state school, my entire existence too disappointingly common for someone who'd married into their circle. Sophie appeared at my door looking apologetic. "Mrs. Morrison is asking to speak with you." Rebecca told her everything apparently, and she seems rather determined. I considered refusing, considered letting Sophie tell her I was too busy coordinating her daughter's wedding to deal with family drama, but curiosity got the better of me, because I genuinely wanted to see how Patricia would attempt to navigate this particular social disaster her son had created. "Send her to the garden," I said. "The private one behind the east wing." 10 minutes later I found Patricia standing amongst the rose bushes I'd personally selected and planted 2 years ago, her posture perfect as always, but something in her face looked almost uncertain, an expression I'd never seen on her before. "Mrs. Morrison," I said, keeping my voice professionally neutral. "I assume Rebecca has explained the situation." She turned to face me fully, and for the first time in 3 years of knowing this woman, I saw her look at me rather than through me, actually seeing me as a person rather than an inconvenient accessory to her son's life. "You own this hotel," she said, not quite a question. "I do. Purchased it 3 years ago with my own savings and a substantial loan, renovated it completely, built its reputation through rather exhausting amounts of work, and yes, everything James told you about me being a hotel manager was technically accurate. I simply happened to own the hotel I was managing." There was a long silence whilst Patricia processed this information, her carefully maintained composure showing hairline cracks as she reassessed everything she'd assumed about me. "I underestimated you," she said finally, the admission clearly costing her something. "We all did." "Yes," I agreed simply. "You did. But I didn't build Hampton House for your approval, Mrs. Morrison. I built it because I'm exceptionally good at what I do and I wanted to prove that to myself, not to your family." Patricia moved closer to one of the rose bushes, touching the petals with surprising gentleness. "My marriage was unhappy," she said abruptly, the words seeming to escape without her permission. 43 years of polite pretense and separate bedrooms and maintaining appearances for the sake of family reputation. I see the signs in James, the same entitled cruelty his father had, the same need to diminish others to feel important. The unexpected honesty caught me off guard, revealing depths I'd never suspected beneath Patricia's perfectly maintained exterior. "Leave him, Violet," she said, turning to look at me with something that might have been genuine concern. "You're young still, you've built something remarkable here, you deserve better than repeating my mistakes, better than wasting decades on a man who'll never value you properly." I felt an unexpected surge of something almost like sympathy for this woman who'd spent her entire adult life trapped in a gilded cage of her own family's making, who'd raised a son in that same toxic environment and was now watching him perpetuate the cycle. "I've already decided to leave him," I said quietly. "I'll be filing for divorce next week. He can keep the flat, I never particularly liked it anyway, too cold, too minimalist, too much his taste and not enough mine." Patricia nodded slowly, something like relief crossing her features. "Good. That's good. And Violet, thank you for making Rebecca's wedding beautiful despite everything my son has done. You've shown more grace today than our entire family deserves." She walked away then, leaving me standing amongst the roses, and I realized that sometimes the people who seem the most certain are actually the most trapped, and that understanding didn't excuse her past behavior but it did make it comprehensible. I returned to my office feeling oddly settled, as though some piece I hadn't known was missing had finally clicked into place. Rebecca's wedding began at 4 o'clock with golden autumn sunlight slanting through the garden trees, creating exactly the kind of magical atmosphere I'd promised when she'd first booked Hampton House 9 months ago. I stood at the back of the ceremony space, partially hidden behind a carefully positioned arbor of white roses and trailing ivy, watching as the string quartet played Pachelbel's Canon and Rebecca walked down the aisle on her father's arm looking absolutely radiant in vintage lace. The groom, Thomas, was a kind-faced architect with gentle eyes who looked at Rebecca as though she'd personally hung the stars in the sky just for him, and watching them exchange vows with such obvious genuine love made my chest ache with the painful recognition of everything my own marriage had never been. James sat in the third row looking pale and miserable, conspicuously alone after his mistress had apparently checked out that morning following their spectacular row, and I allowed myself a moment of cold satisfaction at his obvious discomfort before forcing my attention back to the ceremony itself. I'd worked too hard to make this day perfect to let James's presence poison it for me. The reception flowed seamlessly from ceremony to cocktails to dinner, every detail executing with the precision I'd spent years cultivating in my staff, and I moved through the periphery like a ghost, ensuring everything ran smoothly whilst remaining essentially invisible to the celebrating guests. During the speeches, Thomas surprised everyone by raising his champagne glass not just to his bride but to Hampton House itself. I want to thank the exceptional team here, and particularly the owner, Violet, whose attention to every single detail has made this day absolutely perfect for us. The room erupted in applause, and I felt heat rise to my cheeks as people turned to look at me standing near the service entrance, Rebecca beaming at me with genuine affection whilst James sank lower in his chair as though trying to disappear into the upholstery. Later, as the dancing began and the jazz band filled the ballroom with warm, sophisticated sound, I slipped out to the garden for a breath of air and found myself face to face with a man I'd noticed observing the proceedings throughout the day. "Violet," he said, extending his hand with a smile that reached his eyes. "I'm Marcus Chen. I've been working on the renovation plans for your East Wing extension. We've exchanged emails but never actually met in person." The architect, I realized, the one whose proposals I'd been reviewing for the past month, whose ideas about preserving Victorian features whilst incorporating modern sustainability had impressed me with their thoughtfulness. "Of course," I said, shaking his hand. "Your plans are excellent, very sensitive to the building's character. You've built something remarkable here," he said, gesturing at the hotel glowing warmly in the evening light. "I can see your vision in every corner, the way you've balanced elegance with comfort, history with contemporary function, it's really quite special." We talked for 20 minutes about architecture and design and the challenges of running a boutique hotel, and I realized with something approaching surprise that I was genuinely enjoying the conversation, that Marcus asked real questions and listened to my answers, that he saw my work as valuable and impressive rather than some quaint hobby. It was the first time in months, possibly years, that I'd felt truly seen by someone, valued for what I'd actually accomplished rather than tolerated as an inconvenient presence. When Marcus eventually excused himself to return to the reception, I stood alone in the garden feeling something unfamiliar stirring in my chest, something that felt oddly like hope. Movement near the French doors caught my attention, and I turned to see James standing there watching me, his face twisted with an emotion I couldn't quite read but might have been jealousy, and I realized with sudden clarity that he'd seen my conversation with Marcus, had watched me smile and engage with genuine interest, had witnessed someone treating me with the respect he'd never offered. He started walking toward me, clearly intending to speak, but I raised my hand in a gesture that stopped him mid-stride. "Don't," I said quietly but firmly. "Not here, not now, not tonight." I walked past him back toward the hotel, leaving him standing alone in the gathering darkness, and felt absolutely no guilt whatsoever about it. Sunday morning arrived grey and drizzly, the kind of weather that matched my emotional state perfectly as I sat in my office reviewing the final bills from Rebecca's wedding whilst deliberately not thinking about the conversation I knew was coming. James had been waiting in the lobby since 8 o'clock, Sophie informed me with barely concealed disapproval, sitting in one of the leather armchairs looking progressively more rumpled and desperate as the hours passed. I made him wait until 11 before finally agreeing to see him, partly out of spite but mostly because I genuinely needed those 3 hours to prepare myself for whatever justifications or apologies or manipulations he'd concocted overnight. He entered my office looking worse than I'd ever seen him, unshaven and hollow-eyed, his expensive clothes wrinkled as though he'd slept in them, which he probably had given that his mistress had abandoned him and Rebecca had made it clear he wasn't welcome in the family suites. "Violet," he began, his voice cracking slightly. "Please, I need to explain." "Then explain," I said, leaning back in my chair with my hands folded calmly on the desk, projecting a composure I absolutely didn't feel. The words tumbled out of him in a desperate rush. The affair had been going on for 4 months. He'd met Chloe at his gym. She'd made him feel young and exciting and desired in ways he hadn't felt in years. I was always working and focused on the hotel, and he'd felt invisible and neglected, and he'd made a terrible mistake, but surely we could work through this. I listened to it all without interrupting, watching him perform this theatrical display of remorse, and realized with cold clarity that every word was carefully calculated to shift blame onto me, to make his betrayal somehow my fault for being too ambitious, too dedicated to my work, too successful at building something that didn't center him. "You were always working," he said again, leaning forward earnestly. "The hotel consumed you, Violet. I felt like I didn't exist anymore in your life." "I was building something," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the rage simmering beneath. "I was proving to myself that I could create something valuable and lasting, and yes, James, you're absolutely right that I wasn't focused on you, because you spent 3 years mocking my dreams and belittling my ambitions and making me feel small for wanting more than you thought I deserved." He tried to interrupt, but I raised my hand, silencing him. "And when I succeeded despite your predictions of failure, when the hotel became profitable and respected and sought after, you couldn't bear it, could you? You needed someone who made you feel important because my success made you feel diminished, so you found a woman young enough to be impressed by your job title and your expense account and your borrowed confidence." "That's not fair," he protested weakly. "Fair?" I laughed, the sound harsh even to my own ears. "You cancelled my invitation to your sister's wedding so you could parade your mistress in front of your entire family at my hotel, and you want to lecture me about fairness?" There was a long silence whilst James seemed to deflate, all his prepared arguments collapsing under the weight of simple truth. "I'm sorry," he whispered finally. "Violet, I'm so sorry. Please, can't we try again? I'll do better, I promise, I'll change." For just a moment I felt the pull of it, the temptation to believe him, to go back to the familiar patterns even if they'd been slowly destroying me, because the unknown was terrifying and divorce felt like admitting failure. But then I thought of Patricia's warning about wasted decades, of Marcus's genuine interest in my work, of the hotel I'd built with my own hands despite everyone telling me I'd fail. I removed my wedding ring, the simple gold band I'd worn for 3 years, and set it carefully on the desk between us. "I don't hate you, James," I said. "But I don't love you anymore, and I'm not entirely certain I ever truly did. I loved who I hoped you might become, who I needed you to be, but that person doesn't exist. Violet, please. I want a divorce. You can keep the flat, I never particularly liked it anyway. My solicitor will contact yours tomorrow." He left my office looking shattered, and after the door closed I sat alone staring at the gold ring on my desk and finally allowed myself to cry, not for James but for the time I'd wasted, for the version of myself who'd believed his diminishment was somehow love. Sophie entered quietly with documents. The Thornbury estate confirmed. Major booking, national publicity potential. I wiped my eyes, straightened my spine, and smiled. Schedule the planning meeting. Let's show them what we can do. 3 months later, autumn had given way to winter, and Hampton House wore the season like a jewel, fairy lights wound through bare tree branches in the garden, wreaths of holly and ivy adorning the doorways, the whole place glowing with warmth against the December cold. I stood on the rooftop terrace that had always been my favorite spot, watching the sun set over London in shades of amber and rose, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years settling into my bones like coming home to myself. The divorce had been finalized last week, surprisingly painless once James realized I genuinely wanted nothing from him except my freedom, and the relief of it still felt new and slightly dizzying, like stepping out of a room I hadn't realized was suffocating me until I could finally breathe properly again. Hampton House had flourished in these months, the Thornbury estate wedding bringing exactly the national attention Sophie had predicted, and we were now booked solid through next autumn with a waiting list that grew longer every week. Patricia Morrison had become an unlikely ally, referring wealthy friends and even occasionally meeting me for lunch, our conversations revealing a sharp intelligence I'd never been allowed to see beneath her society matriarch facade, and whilst we'd never be close, there was a mutual respect that felt oddly healing. Rebecca sent cards and messages regularly, her friendship genuine in a way that still surprised me, proof that not everyone in James's family had been complicit in making me feel lesser. Footsteps on the terrace stairs announced Marcus before I saw him, and he appeared carrying 2 cups of coffee, steam rising into the cold air as he crossed to stand beside me at the railing. "Thinking about the future?" he asked, handing me one of the cups. "Always," I said, smiling. "I'm considering a second property, actually, perhaps something on the coast, different aesthetic but same attention to detail." "Ambitious," he observed, but the word held admiration rather than the mockery I'd learned to expect from James. "I've discovered I'm rather good at ambitious," I said. "Turns out when people aren't actively trying to make you smaller, you can actually grow into the person you were meant to be all along." We'd been spending time together over these months, professional meetings about the East Wing renovation gradually extending into dinners and long conversations that had nothing to do with architecture, and I'd found myself slowly, carefully beginning to trust again, to believe that perhaps not everyone would see my success as a threat. Marcus was quiet for a moment, then spoke carefully, as though weighing each word. "Would you like to have dinner with me? Not as architect and client discussing building plans, just as ourselves, 2 people who enjoy each other's company." I looked at him properly, at the kind eyes and genuine smile, at someone who'd never once tried to diminish me or make my accomplishments feel smaller, and felt that unfamiliar hope blooming wider in my chest. "I'd like that very much," I said. Later, alone in my office after Marcus had left, I found myself looking at a photograph I kept in my desk drawer, taken the day I'd signed the papers buying this hotel, exhausted and terrified and absolutely determined, barely recognizing the younger version of myself staring back at me. I'd built this place when everyone said I'd fail, had left a marriage when staying would have been easier, had chosen myself when that choice felt impossible, and looking back now I wouldn't change a single moment of it because every difficult decision had led me here, to this life I'd created entirely on my own terms. The intercom buzzed with Sophie's voice. "Violet, the Johnson family is here for their venue tour." I stood, smoothed down my dress, and caught my reflection in the window, seeing not the woman James had tried to make me but the one I'd fought to become despite him. "Send them up," I said. "I'm ready." And I was ready, for all of it, for the challenges and successes and possibilities stretching out before me like an open road, ready to build something even bigger than what I'd already created, ready to live fully and completely as myself. I walked out of my office toward whatever came next, and I'd never felt more alive.